Welcome to all of you. It's wonderful to have you here for this Sunday at the Abbey presentation this evening. Just to say that this is the fourth of six in a series of 6 women writers who have been invited to reflect on the work of writing as a spiritual practice. We're delighted this evening to have Susan Sink with us as our presenter. She grew up in the Chicago suburbs, a proud graduate of Grinnell College in Iowa, and at this time, she is the author of 3 books of poetry, The Way of All the Earth, Habits, and H is for Harry. She came to St. John's originally, I think, as at the Institute, correct? And then to the Liturgical Press in 2006. And in that role, she is probably best known to you as the author of a wonderful series of books entitled The Art of the St. John's Bible. From 2008 to 2011, she was the communications director for St. Benedict's Monastery, and then went to work for the Episcopal House of Prayer from 2011 to 2016. So you can see she's really kind of circling, huh? Really, okay. And then ultimately I came back in 2016 to be an editorial assistant for the Collegeville Institute and has been there since. One of the themes of her writing has been the exploration of making meaning in the face of unexpected suffering that is part of almost every human life. The title of her presentation is Writing to Reveal the Holy in Brokenness. Welcome, Susan.
First, I want to thank Abbot John for this invitation and thank the monks, not just for coming to this talk, but also for welcoming me from the very beginning in 2005, always honoring my writing. I was invited by Father Michael Quatera to write 3 poems for the Sesquicentennial Vigil and to proclaim them at that service, and that was a big thing for me. And I really have felt very well supported here. Also, I'm so happy to see sisters here who have been so much a part of my life here, and Oblates, and just really every area of my life in St. Joseph. So it kind of turns out that way sometimes, and thank you for coming. So my talk tonight has 3 parts. First, I want to talk about what it means to identify as a spiritual writer, particularly as a Christian Catholic writer, and talk about this question of writing as a spiritual practice. Second, I want to look at how that definition has played out in the writing I've done since I arrived in Collegeville in 2005, how my religious life and practice underlie my vocation as a writer. It also involves some changes that have taken place to my writing since I moved to Minnesota. And then finally, I want to go a little off and talk about not getting published as a spiritual practice. So in what way has writing through the challenge of not getting published been a form of brokenness and my response as a spiritual practice? When Abbot John wrote to ask me to participate in a series on writing as a spiritual practice, my first impulse was to say no. My immediate thought was, I don't think of my writing as a spiritual practice. As I thought more about the topic, I realized I was reacting to a narrow idea of spiritual writing. What I think people mean by writing as a spiritual practice is often writing that is deeply inward and concerned primarily with an individual's spiritual journey, moving from some fallen human place to some spiritual higher place. But that's not what I do in my writing. I want to tell the truth about what it means to be human. And to be human is to be broken in all kinds of ways and for all kinds of reasons, but always in relationship to others. always in community. My primary concern has always been human brokenness, and that brokenness happens in our life with others. I was born into Catholicism, but when I was 12, my mother was sick, and she had a dramatic faith healing experience. And that experience led my mother and we 3 children to move to a Pentecostal fundamentalist church. I would say that I entered that community as a pretty well-formed Catholic, concerned and attentive to embodied spirituality. And what I found at that particular Assembly of God church was a lot of human brokenness. The theology was of transcending that brokenness, and right to the level of my mother's faith healing, right? That her testimony was, God struck me down in order to turn me to depend solely on him, and then he healed me. So that theology of spirituality goes from down here where we are human to up where God relieves us of our humanity in some ways was kind of core. But I was more attentive to the way we responded to each other's brokenness from our own and the power of that experience. So I want to read just one poem from, I have my books so I can hold them up, from The Way of All the Earth, and which has a whole section about that experience. It's overtly about religious experience, and it sets the tone and theme for much of my writing. Healing warts at Christ Chapel Assembly of God Church. The widows came on swollen legs and feet. The pastor brought his gnarled fingers. The parents of the lost child with their distracted look. The pianist with a French twist to deny the tumor. They all came down the aisle to pray for my teenage sister who had warts. They believed enough to press their hands to hers eagerly, wanting God to knot their joints with his strength, the sap flow through their spotted skins on its way to heal the young. They were filled with visions of blind eyes opened by mud and spit, by TV miracles. They were tongued inarticulate with hope. And my sister was a teenage girl who hadn't eaten a full meal in months, or raised her hand in class, or practiced the piano, or clapped in astonishment or praise, or held anyone's hand, or even touched anyone. After attempts to burn the sores away and private, useless family prayers, we admitted our need and called, and it was clear who answered. I'd been afraid they would scorn the petty request, afraid my sister would be hurt by the ordeal of this love, stretching blemished hands to those who expected miracles for their children. But it was also this simple, their hands on her hands, their human voices. It wasn't the healing ever that mattered. It was the love, even done this poorly, what little we could do with what the world allowed, our battered hands and this God. I think in some ways this poem is the clearest expression of my writing project and my spiritual project, battered hands and this God, coming forward with vulnerability in our brokenness to minister to the brokenness of others. When I arrived at the Collegeville Institute as a resident scholar in 2005, I was finishing a memoir about my Assembly of God experience. I was also at a major transition in my life. 2 years before I arrived in Collegeville, my first husband left our marriage. We had moved to Southern California for his job, and after the divorce, I began looking for a way to get back to the Midwest. I also got confirmed in the Catholic Church, something that had been interrupted by my family's conversion away from Catholicism. In addition to writing the memoir while here that tried to make sense of my experiences, I spent a lot of the year at the Institute reading and thinking about the Catholic imagination and what it meant or might mean to be a Catholic writer or a Catholic poet. And Don Ottenhoff told me about Tracy. The Catholic Imagination. There was a whole book called The Catholic Imagination. All I knew about Catholic writers then was Flannery O'Connor. And though I loved her for her darkness and her attention to broken people, I am not a Southern Gothic, and I would never have her sensibility or her stories. And even more than that, I spent a lot of time with Flannery O'Connor, and she is kind of all about people getting their comeuppance. She's kind of harsh to everybody, equally harsh to everybody, but that's not the place from which I'm addressing human brokenness. I had to find my own Midwestern stories, and I read a lot, including the writers of this place. John Hassler, short stories by J.F. Powers, and this collection, which I bought online, edited by Sister Mariella Gable, called Great Modern Catholic Short Stories, divided into 10 stories about nuns, 7 stories about monks, and 9 stories about priests. Some by Hemingway and Mansfield, and not necessarily by Catholic writers at all. But I was saying, is it subject matter or some other quality that makes a writer a Catholic writer, or even a Christian writer? And then I stayed in this place, and as Abbot John said, I worked for Liturgical Press, then the Sisters of the Order of St. Benedict as their communications director, and then at the Episcopal House of Prayer, taking care of that retreat house and interacting with the contemplatives there. And finally back to the Collegeville Institute as an editorial associate and the poetry editor for Bearings Online. Meanwhile, I remarried, and I moved to an 80-acre property that was once the Sisters' hog farm. Before I moved to Minnesota, I had moved every 2 or 3 years of my adult life, living in Iowa, Atlanta, New York City, Northern California, Chicago, Joliet, Reno, and Southern California. When I married and moved to the farm, it was clear I wasn't going anywhere else for the rest of my life. And I was happy about that. And I set about learning and living the stories of this place. I became an oblate of this abbey. I paid attention to the history and lives of the people in this area. I engaged with our prairie, and I began to grow my own food. In these years, my faith and my Catholic practice have deepened, especially as it relates to the embodied spiritual practices I've always valued. For me, the highest moment of my spiritual practice is serving as a Eucharistic minister. I cannot describe the depth of presence that I feel in distributing community at the Church of St. Joseph. People come forward and put their hands out to me, big pads of hands embedded with dirt, sometimes missing fingers from farm or industrial accidents, hands coated in oil, small, fragile hands with long fingers, working hands, elderly hands, children's hands, and I share with them the only thing that in many cases connects us, the body of Christ. I am always moved by this exchange. For me, the hands outstretched to receive Eucharist stand in the same place as the hands reaching out to pray for healing in the Assembly of God Church of my youth. Part 2, this is my life's project. The experience of living here has also changed me as a writer. The biggest shift in my writing has been a move away from writing about myself, which is ironic because I came here writing a memoir. All of my poems, which I continue to write, are completely autobiographical and completely directly rooted in my personal experience, and I also blog. And I did have a second book of poems come out in 2016, H is for Harry, which really tells kind of the story of divorce and remarriage. So a very direct story of my own broken experience in some ways. But in 2011, when my financial situation made it possible for me to work part-time, giving me more time for writing, I started writing novels. My primary motivation was to write something that was not about myself and see if I could tell a large, complex story. I began with a failed attempt to write a novel about contemporary nuns. There's almost no fiction written about contemporary nuns, and when sisters show up in serious literature, they are invariably cloistered mystics. And, two of the best are Mark Salzman's Lying Awake and Ron Hansen's Mariette and Ecstasy, both about ecstatic experience by cloistered sisters, one suggesting that maybe her visions are based on epilepsy, and the other, a sister who has stigmata, both written by men who didn't seem to have the same feeling of humility about writing about sisters that I encountered as I tried to think, do I really know enough to write a novel about sisters? So very quickly I realized I couldn't presume to write about the sisters in the way I wanted to. I couldn't find a story or a way to tell it. I knew I wanted to get on the page the paradox between a community life that seems rooted in denial of individuality and the sisters' strong presence as individuals. The sisters I know are the opposite of cloistered, contemplative stereotypes, the opposite of set apart stereotypes I see represented in the larger culture. In this way, sisters are a good topic for me because I want to write about embodied spirituality. They also know quite a bit about brokenness, but the novel was going nowhere. Then I got a request from my friend Grant Faulkner, who is the director of the National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo, and also runs a website called 100wordstories.com. So he works on both ends of the spectrum. He asked me if I had ever written or would like to write and submit pieces that were exactly 100 words. I thought that was an interesting challenge, and in fact, I very quickly wrote 3 100-word stories based on anecdotes from research I'd been doing for the novel. And I really liked them. And I knew that there were extensive oral histories at St. Benedict's Monastery's archives. I didn't know how incredibly well indexed they are. There's a 2-volume index. You can look up any topic you would ever dream of, and it'll tell you which oral history to go to. And that was compiled by Sister Claire Shadig, who died this week. Let me find my place here. I'd drawn on some of them for obituaries. The reason I knew about them was because I used to write obituaries and jubilarian profiles. And when one would come up for a 75th, someone who was 95, I'd get this file on my desk. And sometimes it was just full of all these great stories. So I'd sit and read these oral histories, but they just kind of mysteriously come up and then go away. So I went to the monastery archive and read and perhaps capture some glimpses of those stories of embodied faith in the lives of religious women. I found stories of ora et labora, of teaching and nursing, of charity and service, of struggling against restrictions on women in the church, of struggling against restrictions on women in America, and all of them about living in community. I strung together stories from the 1930s to the present, from the following the lifespan of a sister from novice to elder, and that collection became Habits. As always, I wanted to tell stories of lived experience. My 2 fears while writing the book were, 1, that all the voices would sound the same, it's such a short story, and 2, that 100 words was not enough to tell a complete story. So the highest compliments I got about that book were that the stories in this book made nuns seem more real to people. That before this book, some readers had not seen nuns as complex or, in fact, fully realized human beings. And truly, this shouldn't have to be an accomplishment, but it is. And it's what I wanted to do. I know very well from my life in churches, especially as an evangelical teenage girl, that spiritual women are asked to deny their physical selves, to split and privilege the spiritual over the physical. But that is not a truthful spirituality, and that is not the spirituality of the religious women that I know. I heard the sisters were very enthusiastic about the book. I actually think it was kind of helpful. It came out shortly after the St. Bede's sisters came, And they started sharing these stories, and someone even said, oh, during dinner we couldn't remember the sister's name, and we ran and got your book and brought it to the table, and that made me really happy. Other sisters said that the book wasn't spiritual enough, and that's totally fair. I was writing the stories that I write, stories of living in human community and living in as physical beings in a world infused with brokenness and also with God. And I want to read two stories from that book. The first one is called Life's Liturgy. There's some German in here, but I translate it. And the German part came from a specific sister telling me this story. The rest of it I kind of made up to fit my purposes. So, Life's Liturgy. When we children were ready for bed, we said, Gelobt sei Jesus Christus. And to our Praise be Jesus Christ, the adults responded, In Ewigkeit, Amen. Going to bed was liturgical. We lived our faith, practiced its words and gestures. It made climbing the stairs to bed a procession. Even the barn was a sacred place. We kept it clean as though Mary and Joseph could show up at the door any evening in need of a place to stay. We kneeled to tie our shoes, baked bread with scrubbed hands, lit candles for the dinner table, and said our prayers. And then this comes from Sister Jeremy Hall and oral history, although I changed it pretty significantly. It's called Particular Friendships. Something people might know about in there. One night, Hilda, also a novice, had a nightmare that I had been expelled from the convent. Without thinking, she climbed into bed with me. It was that simple. She lay her head on the pillow and was able to fall right to sleep. She woke up the next morning terrified of consequences and practically flew out of the room. Word got out, and I was reprimanded about particular friendships. I said we were not particular friends, but genuine friends. A year before, she had slept 4 girls to a bed on the farm. She was homesick, I said. That's all. So, there's real treasures in that stuff. In 2013, after Habits, my same friend Grant Faulkner suggested I should now try NaNoWriMo, which is writing a novel in 30 days. At that point, I had found another story. I wanted to write one without sisters in it, a crime story with a straightforward plot. I didn't reach the 50,000 word goal in 1 month, but by the end of January of the next year, I had something I liked. I rewrote the manuscript multiple times over 2 years until I was satisfied. The novel is based on the shooting of Tom Decker, the Cold Spring officer who was ambushed behind a bar and killed with a shotgun in November 2012. What had really grabbed my attention about that crime was the fact that his partner left the scene. In a panic, his partner, a part-time policeman who hung drywall as the other part of his work life, backed his car to the alley when the shot was fired. And when he returned, the killer was gone. The partner was branded a coward, and Tom Decker, the victim, became a hero. The very American experience and treatment of this hero and this coward really stayed with me for a year. I wanted to write a story about it. And the brokenness here it's from the point of view of the partner who left the scene, who is a pariah in the community, and who through this one reaction his whole life changes and his character is maligned, and he's run out of town, basically. In my book, the hero would be revealed to be a coward, and the coward would live up to being an ordinary hero. I took the incident and some of the public aspects of the crime, but I don't know these people or anything really about the true story. I did research with the St. Joseph Police Department about small town policing, and actually my first full reader was Mary Beth Munden, who works at the police station, and she said, oh my God, what are you doing? But then she said, by page 10, I just forgot I forgot completely it was about that story. So it's very much a ripped from the headlines kind of, lest people worry that I'm, in over my head. It's okay. The book is called Officer Down. It's set in a fictionalized Cold Spring, a place I lived in from 2006 to 2008. An amazing setting for a book. And I put what I know in it about good people into that book. What I know about small towns, about Minnesota baseball, about Catholics, about kids who ride snowmobiles to school, about dishonoring the family name. So much of what I learned from the many stories I know about this place are in that book in one way or another, including cultural Catholicism, deep formation, no longer connected to church participation. And I think part of what I'm saying here is that as I've moved into this other writing, moving away from myself, I've also moved away from I did habits, but overtly religious writing. So the two novels that I've written, this and the next one, are a movement away from that, but I still feel they're deeply connected to that life's project. After Officer Down, while submitting queries to agents to try to get that book published, I almost immediately began writing a second, more complicated book. It's called Failure to Thrive. And guess what? It's a total bummer of a story. When I tell people about it, or even the title, their number one reaction is to cringe. I finished it in its current form this past year during a year-long writing workshop at the Loft, which helped me stay disciplined and keep my faith in the project and in my ability. And some people in the workshop didn't like it because it was too much like real life and too dark. The novel is set near Grand Forks, North Dakota, and tells the story of a family barely holding on. At its center is Gary Reese, a working-class guy who used to be a baker. As times changed, the grocery where he worked downsized, and finally, when Walmart arrived, eliminated its bakery. His current job is driving truck, delivering burial vaults, and doing the setup for funerals. He takes his 81-year-old father, Jim, with him in his large rural territory. American Story, set in 2008-2009 at the economic downturn. Early in the novel, Gary's year-old granddaughter, Lily, is diagnosed with failure to thrive. His daughter, Cece, the child's mother, is an alcoholic, although no one realizes it. Her husband is away working in the fracking fields of the Bakken, and she's struggling at home with two small children. Her conflict with the state over the custody of Lily and this family's unraveling is the core of the story. Gary has a small plot of land on the Red River, and it's a world unto itself. It is bordered by beet fields to the west, beyond the dense shelter belt, a great North Dakota word, that he's planted, and the flooding and receding Red River to the east. The characters are again cultural Catholics who no longer attend church. Sometimes they don't bury still in the winter because of the frozen ground. So sometimes in the spring, when there are burials, all the mourners have had their memorial service and moved on, and it's up to Gary and Jim as the only people at the burial to say a prayer for the dead. So again, I gotta say I love this story. I did just finish it. I'm working on the revision, so I'm pretty established in it. And I have no idea if I will ever be able to get this book published, which takes me to my third and final section. In my writing life, I've had some success. I was a Stegner Fellow in Poetry at Stanford University. I've received prestigious residencies at artist colonies. Some of my poems have been in really good literary magazines, but I have not had success publishing books in the traditional route. This is important in part because publishing is a necessary validation. The conventional route for poets is to publish a book through a competition and secure an academic position from which to continue writing. And really up until 2003, that's what I was doing. But after more than a decade of trying to publish my first book of poems, I self-published it in 2003, to the great disappointment of my writer friends. They saw this as giving up. I recognized that it marked a conscious decision to walk away from the poetry world. After 10 years of submitting to contests and cycling work in and out of the manuscript, it was clear to me that waiting for it to rise to the top was keeping me from writing other books. Also, I didn't want an academic position anymore. I was working as a community college teacher. I'd been doing that for 10 years. I loved teaching at the community college, and I had no interest in being in an English department in a four-year university. Still, I didn't want The Way of All the Earth to go into a box in my closet. I still gave readings now and then, and I wanted to have a book to offer, and that's why I self-published. The memoir, despite getting a New York agent, did not get published. It was rejected very kindly by all the best publishing firms in New York. And I knew from the beginning that I was going to self-publish Habits. However, I also felt a tremendous burden to get that book to readers. I didn't know what to do. All I could think of was to send out 10 copies of the book with a press release to the St. Cloud Times, national and regional Catholic publications, and also Julia Vieira's A Nun's Life blog, because I love her. The St. Cloud Times writer Frank Lee, who I worked with on a number of stories about the monastery, did a feature. I was thrilled about that, but I couldn't have predicted what would happen next. The Associated Press picked up that story and offered it as their religious story for the month, the week or two before Thanksgiving. So the story ran in all sorts of places, and it was featured on Minnesota Public Radio website, where it was the most clicked story for 3 days in a row. I mean, it just took off. I ended up becoming a bookseller, and I sold almost 2,000 books, which is really kind of unheard of for a book like that. A self-published book, a book of 100-word stories, basically a book of poems about nuns. So it was amazing. Even so, 2,000 copies was not my idea of success back in the 1990s. But it was a success, and it made me happy, even though I had no way to think about how to build on it. In some ways, it didn't even occur to me to try to build on it. I just kept writing, moving on to Officer Down. And this is kind of in conclusion, sort of. Okay. I came across a Henry Nouwen quote a couple of weeks ago that helped shed light on this question of publishing versus writing. The quote is from the essay Called to Fruitfulness, and it reads, "We have been called to be fruitful, not successful, not productive, not accomplished. Success comes from strength, stress, and human effort. Fruitfulness comes from vulnerability and the admission of our own weakness." So again, success, strength, stress, and human effort. Fruitfulness comes from vulnerability and the admission of our own weakness. The context he was writing it in is actually related to today's gospel, the Beatitudes, and the ways in which we make ourselves vulnerable by being poor in spirit, by being, the Beatitudes are what this is about in a way. For a long time, I was focused on being successful as a writer. That success would be reflected in publishing and position. And when asked if my writing was a spiritual practice, I drew back. No, my writing is not part of some personal journey. My writing is not just to get me to God. My writing is about success. But I can see, in large part from doing the work of writing this talk, that my writing life has not actually been about success, but about fruitfulness. If it was about success, I would have given up already. My writing comes from vulnerability and the admission of our own weakness. My work comes out of my own brokenness, and is attentive to the brokenness of others. Facing and contemplating the brokenness of life in community and life in the world is what I'm about. And I'm doing that work because I believe that that is where God is revealed. Doesn't mean that I don't want readers. I do. I have something to say, and I believe in what I'm saying. But ultimately, Steve doesn't want me to talk about him, but when we were throughout this, I married Steve in 2008, and I was writing, and I'd write something, and he'd say, now, if this one doesn't make it, what are you going to do? And I'd say, I'm going to write the next one. He'd say, okay, but if that one doesn't make it, what are you going to do? And I'd say, I think I'm just going to write the next one. So it took him a while to catch on to that idea, but I think he sees it, now. In my novels, as in my poems, as in my memoirs, as in all the writing I've done that matters to me, there are a lot of broken people. There's brokenness at the heart of it. Sometimes it is the result of a fallen world. It is always a matter of mortality. It is rooted in my perception that most violence in the world is domestic. Sometimes we are broken by circumstance, but more often by other people, including people we love. But all of us are holding on and embracing life. My characters and I have some inner core of resilience or character or faith that moves us forward. And figuring out how to live in the midst of, not in spite of, the brokenness, who we are to each other, how we carry on and even find joy and peace and love, our battered hands and this God. Well, that is why we have a spiritual practice, and that is why I write. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Please, questions, observations, connections. So I'm going to pose a question, Susan.
Okay.
And that is so you're a young girl growing up, and your mom has this religious experience, and you move from a Catholic environment to a Pentecostal Assembly of God. How did you, in that transition, because of the formative power of those years, how did you loop back into the embodied spirituality and obviously a sacramental imagination that just is layered across everything you're doing? How did that happen?
I think in some ways I also felt in thinking about the talk, like, well, I'm probably preaching to the choir here. Like, these are not people who reject brokenness, or, am I still having an argument with the Pentecostal, tradition, and really I didn't want to mention her here, but with my mother. In that she didn't even know at Christmas what my novel was about, this next novel. And I realized, I didn't tell her because she just wants me to write something happy. She just still, and she feels very disappointed that the religious story, the spiritual story that I have to tell has so much negative stuff in it, or is so coming out of that. And one thing I would say is the crucifix. That when we went, the Assembly of God Church is completely iconoclastic. We were basically sitting in a church with stained glass and sacraments and all this, and then we were sitting in a school room with stackable chairs and a man in a business suit, leading the worship, and a screen onto which the hymn texts were projected, and no cross, to go from church to church was just completely, I have to figure this out. Because the things that I thought were sacred or were part of that reality are not here. And the Bible was there, text was there, the Word of God and God as Word was there. But I think, For a while, my mother and my sister called our church, Christ Chapel, the hospital church. And they said, people come here in bad shape, and they get the Holy Spirit, and they get all this good feeding, and then they get spiritually strong, and then they go off to another bigger church. And we're here with, all the people who are trying to get there. And I don't think I cared so much about getting there to the bigger, more peaceful, less engaged place. So my argument is that I took into the experience of that healing and what we were doing there, the sense that we were people laying hands on each other, and that was the sacraments of that place, not the grape juice in little cups and and the crackers, So it was a different sacramentality. Yeah.
Please. Could you use the mic?
Oh, yes.
Renee.
Or could someone bring it to you? Oh, wow.
Didn't mean to come up here as an example of the brokenness, but Susan, I've been reading your blog for a long time and thinking that I would like to respond, but I'm in awe of one thing about you and what you're doing, and that is, and this is so simple, but you often write about cooking, and I can tell from that you are in the moment, mindful of the gift, whatever it happens to be. And that makes your other books more believable. Because now that I know who wrote that, and I'm an Oblate here too, and I remember meeting you once about 5 years ago. But I just want to say thank you for that day-to-day living in the presence. So no question, just thank you.
Thank you. Definitely the biggest surprise to anyone in the world that I turned out to be a gardener. All those places I listed, I lived, it was urban, The break for me in that life from pursuing that poetry and moving to all those places and being up and then coming here is pretty dramatic, And the cooking is part of it. Father Renee.
You mentioned, excuse me, you mentioned that you moved away from writing about yourself to writing about others and how this all came together. But I wonder, when anyone writes or speaks, it's always, it seems to me, speaking about the way that a person sees the world and sees, and for example, in what you're talking about, the brokenness, but also seeing little hopeful visions within that. But I do think that one can't get away from writing about oneself, whether you're talking about the way the Grand Canyon looks or whatever it might be. Is that fair?
That is 100% fair. And that's actually one of the things I claim for Habits and the two stories that I read, is that, I'd go in there with little slips of paper and just take brief notes. I didn't want to grab 100 words from this sister's story or this sister's story. I knew that I was writing about what concerns me, I didn't want to say this is so-and-so and this is so-and-so. There's seeds from them, but the story that I wanted to tell is about myself and my own concerns. And certainly in the novels, I am very interested in how we shape stories, but I mean, Gary in the North Dakota story is a real person who has been extremely generous to me. He does not have a child with failure to thrive, but my first husband's sister did, and we almost adopted her. So I'm grabbing from my own experience and making fiction that makes sense of a larger reality. It's terrifying to write fiction because you have to create a whole believable world, and there's, suddenly she finds herself in rehab. I don't know anything about residential rehab. So you're on the spot to keep creating in a way that it's easier to go with your own life experience, I think, in some ways. But yeah, it's always, yeah. And I identify with all of them. And Flannery O'Connor, all those people getting their comeuppances are her. She's the uppity New York intellectual who's bumbling around and losing her leg and getting tricked, So it's always rooted in that. Yeah.
Your sincerity in all three of the areas that you talked about and the brokenness, you didn't let it control you at all. And that's one thing that's very difficult to do. Even when you were younger, you noticed when you went to the other church, we had stained glass windows, we had a crucifix, we had, how many of us at that time, what were you, 12? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
I guess I could tell you what my church looked like, but I don't know if I would be that specific about it. But even the move, you took something with you at every place, every stop.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit more about that because my mother, to this day says, I hope you know I did not make you leave the Catholic Church. It was your decision. And so she had this faith healing, and they sent a pastor, we went to this church, but we still kept going to the Catholic Church for a whole year. On Saturday night, we went to Mass, and on Sunday morning, we went to the Assemblies of God Church. And on Monday night, I went to CCD for confirmation. One of the most depressing, if you want to get a 12-year-old out of the church, send them to a year of CCD. I was fighting for Catholicism for that year. And when we finally got to the spring, and my mother said, okay, where should we go? She said that I said to her, and I remember this, I know it's true, I said, all my friends are just talking about their parties and their confirmation names. They have not taken this seriously. I think we have to go to the other one because God is there. People are speaking in tongues. People are giving prophecy. Jesus is there. We're reading the Bible. I can't, as a 13-year-old, fight with that reality.
But the other thing is, though, that you didn't hang on to anger about any of it.
Oh, no.
And you moved back, and you took with what you had there and brought it back into your second marriage, into your whole lifestyle, and how you are writing today. And of course, that sincerity that you have, that comes through with everything you're doing. Mm-hmm. Hearing you and reading are two different ways of contemplating of who you really are. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Mary.
You've talked a lot about your own perspective and how you've woven your life into what you've written. Could you say something about the response you get from your readers? For example, especially if people recognize themselves, for example, in habit, and they say, oh, really? And see a new side of themselves, reject it, whatever. I'd be interested in some of those responses.
You know, Habit's got an amazingly good response. People think it's a really funny book, which kind of surprised me, but I think there's a lot of joy in it, and I think I wanted to get that too. And, you know, in a way, Habits does not fit with the brokenness theme, I don't think. Although people come out of all sorts of different experiences. Sisters who left the convent, oh, I can't believe they made that sister take off her habit when she wanted to wear it so badly. You know, they'll focus in on one story or one hurt that they're still nursing, you know, but for me, the biggest thing was it was also came out not too long before the big museum exhibit that was traveling around. And Julie Vieira, who does this A Nun's Life blog, interviewed me on a podcast. And all kinds of sisters from all kinds of communities, people were saying, I'm buying a copy for my sisters in my town, you know, or I'm buying a copy. And they just said, oh my gosh, we all had this experience, you know, and I think it was very affirming of the way of life and some of the, you know, experiences and challenges and of growing up through that and having all this things happen. I think it's a pretty successful kind of brief overview of things that showed up in that museum exhibit and things that I heard from people telling me their stories, and it was completely positive, except for a couple of people saying it wasn't spiritual enough. It was really quite positive.
That's helpful. Then what about the poems you said about brokenness?
My mother's friend read it and said it sounded like a mentally ill person who was calling, like a cry for help. You know, I mean, these are what I'm arguing with. This is why I'm being so stringent about this. It's not the story that my sister or people in that Assemblies of God church would have liked told, and in some ways there's a lot of reading it too literally or you know, various things like that. When I give readings, it's extremely well received. All my poems, you know, when H is for Harry came out, I mean, again, brokenness I haven't shared, but I am, you know, living with cancer, and I had just gotten the diagnosis the same month that H is for Harry came out. And I already had some readings and a party set up, and there I was with my bald head and my, you know, scarf, and people came to hear it and, you know, were moved, you know, and in part they're moved by me, you know, and in part they're moved by the poems, but my work presented by me does very well.
I'm just moved in terms of what you're describing right now is a testimony to fruitfulness. You didn't get published the way you want, but
Yeah.
there's obviously a lot of fruitfulness.
Yeah. And to me, the fact that I can come here and see people from so many different areas of my life in this place, you know, when I gave the launch party for Ages for Harry, a friend of mine from when I was 4 or 5 years old came. I only know her through Facebook now, but she came. And I look over, I lived in all those places. I still have friends from all those places, people who care about me. And, you know, I am a very lucky, very rich person. And they show up for my work too. So,
Thank you much.
yeah, thank you.
Let's thank Susan for a wonderful.
Thanks.